stranger in a strange land. Before reading this book, I only knew it as lyrics to this famous Billy Joel song called "We Didn't Start the Fire." Well, after reading the book, I can see why Billy Joel found it to be such a cultural touchstone that was meant to be immortalized within that song. To kind of show you how special this book is, I'm actually going to give a little bit of a story on the story itself. From what I've gathered, this book actually took 10 years for the writer to be able to complete. The author was not in much of a hurry to complete this book. He knew it was going to be challenging. It was going to be radical. And he had to wait for a time where such a thing could be seen as accepting. And of course, it would make sense that the book would first be published in the 1960s. This was quite a rebellious time. It was the rise of a counterculture movement. Today we refer to them as the hippies. And after reading this book, I kind of wonder how much of the hippie lifestyle came from this. I suppose that's really all I have for the preface. If I were to summarize this book in one word, it would be challenging. Not so much that it was difficult to read, in the sense that it used large vocabulary or anything. No, I found it just fine to read. But it was the ideas presented within it. That was where the challenge came from. But enough talk. What exactly is Stranger in a Strange Land about? This is the story of Michael Valentine Smith. He was the product of a very important mission. So this takes place in an alternate reality, very similar to our own, but any resemblance is pure coincidence, as the author writes before the book even begins. At this time in humanity, people realize that the greatest enemy of humans are humans themselves. So, there is a research team of 8 of the world's most brilliant scientists, 4 married couples, that are sent to Mars to figure out if such a planet possesses such a threat. For a little bit, contact was going all right between the Earth and the spaceship. However, the last contact with them was that they landed before the radio went silent for a few months. Before a detachment could be sent back up, World War III broke out. And this I find rather fascinating. This is one of the few times I've ever heard of World War III that didn't end the world as we know it. Instead, it just delayed any sort of reconnaissance for the next 20 years. Another ship was found, and that is where they found Michael. He had been born on the planet and was the only survivor of that crew. He was taken in by the Martians, and when this rescue party was brought in, they wanted to bring back Michael to planet Earth. Obviously, there is a fair bit of prep involved, as the gravity on Mars is a quarter of that on Earth. So it was really a slow travel from Mars to Earth for him to get acquainted with the gravity. And while he did know some English, there was not really enough to be able to get anywhere. So he was slowly taught the ins and outs of how to be able to speak. One of the big things that instantly hooked me on this book was its sense of humor. So, it's a particularly long night, and one of the doctors that is attending to Michael Smith just needed a break and started smoking outside with some guards that are tasked with keeping Michael safe. One of the guards leans over and says, "So, busy night, Doc?" "Yeah, the patient had 8 babies, and we were trying to figure out how to be able to name them all." Obviously, I, as well as the rest of the guards, had a good laugh at this. One of the other big things as well is that they wanted to slowly introduce the concept of being human to Michael. And the biggest way they did this was that only male doctors that were allowed to treat him. Enter Jillian Boardman. She is a nurse on staff in Bethesda, Maryland, which that is where Michael has been placed after he finally made it to the Earth. Jillian has been hearing the rumors around the cafeteria about a patient that doesn't know what a woman is. Jillian is obviously quite curious about this, and since Michael is on her same floor, she decides to investigate. Pops her head in, to which Michael is just immediately in shock about it. It is later revealed that the concept of gender doesn't really exist on Mars, which kind of begs the question how they reproduce. There is the idea that they have nests and they lay eggs, but the idea that there is no male or female, but rather some sort of androgynous conglomeration of the group, really lends itself to some more thinking. But the author didn't bother with these details, so I'm not going to bother with these details. So, Jillian decides to attend to some of Michael's needs. And the first thing she does is gives him a glass of water. Now, this is a really big deal, as water is a very scarce resource on Mars, and it is only used in very special ceremonies. So Michael takes a swig, and then hands it off to Jillian. Jillian is confused by this, but figures she'll play along, so she takes a sip from the same glass as well. It is only later that we realize that she is now part of the Water Brothers, which probably the best way to describe it, it's a lot like adopting a child, in the idea that all of a sudden you are part of the family, and whenever one member is in trouble, everybody else goes to their aid. Jillian's shift gets out when she receives a phone call from a good friend of hers, Ben Caxton. He is a newspaper reporter, and he intends to try to pump her for information onto who this man from Mars is. However, he's been in the newspaper business for a while, and he's a lot more sly than that. So he just simply says, "Why don't you come over to my place and I'll make you a nice steak." Now in this reality, the idea of real steak from a cow is quite a rarity. Most of the stuff is synthesized to look like real meat, and a lot of other food stuff is very similar. She goes to his place, and there they get to talking when Ben pops the question, "Do you know anything about this man from Mars?" To which she's a little hesitant about giving away the details, as the idea that she was in a restricted room is something that could easily lose her job. But Ben is able to coax her into giving her some more information. He doesn't really have a whole lot to go for when Ben comes up with an idea. What he has in his possession is a miniature tape recorder. It is something that is very sensitive, and it could be several rooms away to record what exactly is going on with this man from Mars. This works out pretty well, as Jillian has to attend to a geriatric patient that's mostly sleeping all the time anyway, so she's able to place the recorder there and is able to replace the spool every day. That is until the fourth day, when this patient gets up and realizes that she's doing something in her closet. Well, the tape recording session stopped from there. But after that day, Ben invites her over to his place again. Now, another fun little detail to mention as well is that Ben Caxton has grass in his living room. This is another luxury that doesn't belong to this version of Earth. Now, that may seem like a small detail to mention, but part of me does kind of wonder if maybe Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was kind of based off of some of the weird, zany situations that are brought up in this book. But, as I mentioned before, I'm not too big a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as The universe itself doesn't really feel all that tangible, but this one does. It might have some weird little details in it here and there, but it's explained in such a way that it feels like this universe can exist in another dimension. So with that little diversion out of the way, Ben motions to Jillian to not say a word, as it could be possible that maybe somebody has bugged his apartment. So what he does is he brings a transcript of what was recorded on that spool, to which there was one really important detail. The chairman of the Federation, Mr. Douglas, comes in to talk to the man from Mars. His intentions are quite clear: to be able to get ownership of the planet, and he is trying everything he can in his power to have Michael favor that right by any means necessary. He even shoos out the doctor that is under his care. Thankfully for Michael, though, all this overwhelms him too much, and he goes into a, I guess maybe catatonic state would be the best way to say it. Not necessarily a coma, but he just kind of blacks out. He is exhausted for the time being. And Douglas leaves. After that, Ben decides to take Jillian to a restaurant. This is a place where they don't have to worry about bugs so much. Now, I mentioned how Ben had grass growing in his apartment. Well, this restaurant has palm trees in it, and there is a miniature stereophone on every table, which, for simplicity's sake, let's just call them televisions, because that's basically the purpose that they serve. Ben tells Jillian everything that he knows about Michael Valentine Smith. So as I mentioned, he was a product of a very important space mission. Well, his mother, shortly before leaving the Earth, put a patent on a rocket motor that is not only still in use, but has a stock value that is worth millions of dollars. And due to a legal loophole, Michael is technically the sole owner and sole sovereign of Mars. And that is exactly what Mr. Douglas was trying to rid Michael of. Now, what exactly happened to his parents is left rather vague. The only thing that's really mentioned is the idea that while they were 4 couples, the 2 that did the deed were not of the same marriage. I know there is another term to describe this, but I don't like using that kind of curse word. But shortly after Michael was born, there was this rumor that there was a suicide pact and that they all killed themselves. And that is how the Martians found Michael. He never knew his real parents very long, and that is kind of where his limited knowledge of the English language came from. Instead, he only really knows Martian. During this conversation, a very interesting piece appears on the stereophone. It is the man from Mars giving a press conference. However, Jillian is just completely distraught about the whole thing, as she tells Ben, "That's not the man from Mars. It certainly looks a lot like him, and they even got some of his mannerisms down, but it's not him." Ben, realizing there's a scoop, decides to investigate. But before he does it, he puts in a safeguard for Jillian, basically saying that if he is unsuccessful, if he completely loses contact with Jillian, to be able to make it to Jubal Hashaw. He is a master when it comes to newspaper reporting, and because he has gone through so many different stories, he is able to give them refuge from any sort of law that may or may not be after her for such a story. So Ben's plan is to invite a fair witness. Now, they really go into detail a lot about who this fair witness is. But for simplicity's sake, let's just say this is his job. He is really good at it, and as such, he charges an exuberant amount of money. With the witness, he goes in to see Michael. to which Ben is disturbed just like Jillian was, as it's the same exact person that was in the press conference. Ben attempts to ask him a few questions before he goes into a catatonic state as well. As they are walking out, the fair witness said, "You should have checked his feet." But why his feet? Well, he's used to being on Mars, isn't he? He doesn't have all that gravity that's been wearing on his feet like the rest of us. But why didn't you tell me this before? I'm a fair witness. My job is only to look, not to talk. Ben is understandably outraged at this and tries everything in his power to be able to get another interview. However, he made a rookie mistake. In this future, we have flying cars. Pretty standard. But we also have self-driving cars, or in this case, a taxi. Ben is in a taxi when he is slowly trying to work his way up the chain to get up to Mr. Douglas, free up another interview. Well, obviously the Federation doesn't take kindly to this, and reroutes the taxi into a maximum security prison. It's about a week, and Jillian has obviously heard nothing about Ben. However, there's not really a whole lot for her to do, as the man from Mars has been transferred to another hospital. Or so she thinks. As she is attending to one of the other patients, she finds the man from Mars in a back room, slowly starting to build up the ability to read. It is then that Jill has pieced it together. Mr. Douglas has made a fake man from Mars for publicity as well as even for a bit of legality. And once this puppet has served its purpose, he can do whatever he wants with it. And so the real man from Mars is very much in danger, because if the puppet doesn't work out, they could attempt to go after the real one for legal purposes. It is then Jillian makes the first big step in her adventure. She decides to get Michael out of there. This wasn't all that difficult, as his physique is very androgynous looking. Jillian dresses him up as a female nurse, and right as she's about to go home, she calls another taxi for her and Michael. Thankfully, nobody stopped to talk to her in any way, but as the taxi is in the air, Jillian realizes that her home would be the first place that they would suspect. So instead, she has the taxi drop them off at Ben Caxton's place. This turned out to be a bit of an issue, though, as Ben left the place locked, and Jillian has no idea how to open it. But by accident, Jillian speaks out the password, and so they are in. Before going out into the world, Jillian wants to give Michael a bath. Not only does he have a stink to him, but it's very obvious that he was left in a place where not a lot of people checked on him. The plan was, after the bath, to be able to get him into Ben's clothing and then make their way to the famous Jewel Hatshaw that Ben was talking about. However, this doesn't go well, as all of a sudden the police force track Jillian down. She tries her best to convince them that Michael is not there, but they search the premise and find him in the tub. Jillian tries to put up a fight, and one of the people pulls a gun on her, and they are about to use force, when all of a sudden the man holding the gun just disappears. The buddy is just as shocked and is trying to figure out what happened, so he attempts to take the shot and disappears as well. They are alone in Ben Caxton's place, where Jillian is just sobbing from overwhelming emotion, to which Michael is like, "Did I do wrongness? Is it because I wasted the meat?" But Jillian is just so beside herself that she cannot respond to Michael's inquiries. It is then that Michael goes into another catatonic state. Jillian seizes the opportunity and realizes that she can smuggle him inside of a big briefcase. Obviously, it's pretty difficult to be able to get him to cram in there, but he's surprisingly flexible. She is struggling to get the suitcase into a nearby car when one of the people at the apartment says, "What do you got in there, woman?" "Oh, it's a dead body." And then, just like the doctor from before, they both just laugh it up. Now that is where part 1 of the book ends. There are 5 parts to this book. Obviously, the leader of the Federation is very disturbed by this. The idea that now that the real man from Mars is gone, he no longer has any sort of leverage over the whole Mars situation. It is there we are introduced to Mr. Douglas's wife. And one of the things I found particularly funny about her is they're talking when she says, "What is it with all this science? All this science isn't going to be able to help you track down Michael. In my book, there is only one science. Astrology." It's kind of crazy how the book is as old as it is, but I have met a few people like that. It's not an insult by any means, but astrology is pretty popular these days. She calls up her medium that she just has at her beck and call, Madame Vasud. She tries in uncertain terms to try to get the location of the man from Mars. This is obviously a very difficult thing as, well, Michael was not born on this planet, so as such the astrological charts have to then be adjusted to what they are in The Martian. She legitimately tries her best, but Madame Vasud is a bit of a con woman. I feel like it's best said later in the book. A con man is somebody that can get you to believe something, even though the con man doesn't believe it. What a shaman does is get you to believe something, but the shaman also believes it. It's a very similar thing here with Madame Vasud. We then cut to Jillian. It's a bit of a mystery how, but she did manage to find the enigmatic Jubal Hashaw. She is able to get sanctuary there, and we get an idea of how this place is run. Jubal is probably in his late 60s, and he has, for lack of a better term, a harem of women in their 30s that are just at his beck and call. Now, the main reason I feel a little hesitant about using that term harem is he doesn't have sex with any of them. They are just there to attend the needs of his luxurious estate. To be able to clean, to cook, as well as be at the beck and call whenever he comes up with the idea of an editorial or a short story or non-such. He has a lot of people on staff, and he calls to all of them by saying, "Front," and they all rotate on the day as to who gets to be in what position. So it is here that Jubal tries his best to be able to understand what it means to be Martian. And on top of that, we really get an idea of Michael's power. As he demonstrated before, he has the ability to make things disappear into midair. Jubal tries this with a whole bunch of cameras and realizes that the object slowly shrinks until it just no longer exists anymore. And on top of that, he also has complete control of his body. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that, well, if he were in the Himalayas, he can control his body temperature to not feel the bitter cold, to not feel pain if he got pricked, or to be able to slow his heart rate and breathing to a point where he can stay underwater for several hours, which obviously at first this very much disturbed Jubal, as he just had a tendency to just jump into his pool and just stay at the bottom for a long time. But after all this is discovered, Jubal is not so much afraid. And along the way, Michael is able to pick up all the reading material that Jubal has on hand. He has a massive library with all kinds of dictionaries, encyclopedias, books on law, investments, and Michael chows down on these like it's me at a Chinese buffet. As time passes, Jill starts to get a little more and more worried about Ben Caxton. She tries to figure out some way to be able to figure out if A, he's alive, and B, where he is. As soon as Jubal gets smart to her plan, he says, no, I'll take care of it. I know how this works. So through his various contacts with the newspaper industry, he realizes that the best way to get to Michael Douglas is through his wife. And through his wife is the medium, Madame Vasud. And wouldn't you know, Jubal used to be best friends with her. He is able to call her up and give Miss Douglas a reading about the man from Mars. How things should be handled in such a circumstance. And thank goodness he did, because the next day, the police arrive, wanting to collect Michael as well as anybody that may be involved in the conspiracy to keep him. Jubal, having all those law books and read them as well, he looks at the warrant and just kind of says, well, this can't possibly be right. You're giving me all these charges? Well, you know, under this statute, under this way, only your superior officer can be able to do this to me. And that is able to buy him a few extra hours while he tries his best to get in contact with Mr. Douglas. The superior officer comes back, and that is when Jubal is on the phone. In fact, the superior officer has Jubal in his hands when on the phone, Michael Douglas chews out the superior officer saying, no, you can't arrest this man. We are negotiating here. And you are ruining everything. What is your name, rank, and serial number? And they're able to come to an agreement about what is to be the fate of Mars, as well as the king's ransom that Michael owns in all this stock. And one of the conditions of the agreement is that he is to give a news story as to where Michael is. Obviously, Mr. Douglas is a little annoyed by this, as he told the press the location of the fake man from Mars, which is in the Andes Mountains. So he has to figure out how to be able to turn it in such a way that he's at Jubal Hashaw's place. But the details are hammered out, and so Jubal starts the first interview. Now, a short time later is where we jump into the negotiations. In Jubal, he is all about decorum. So when he sees that Mr. Douglas has the flag of the Federation as well as the anthem going to be played, he's just like, well, where is the Martian flag? Where is the Martian anthem? If he is the sole owner of Mars as well as the sole sovereign, he needs to be given the respect of any visiting dignitary. To which the staff is just completely in awe by this, but they try their best. They were able to improvise a makeshift flag, as well as take a piece from a very famous planetary classical movement and decide to just play the Mars section. And the other big thing as well is the seating arrangement. In addition to Jillian, as well as all the other people at Jubal's place, Michael has actually attained quite a lot of water brothers, which are all around that table. And they all occupy the same space, which everybody is kind of disturbed by this, as other visiting dignitaries that have stock in the idea of what happens from Mars wants to sit next to Michael. But Jubal is like, no, this is part of his envoy. You can't do that. You have to sit in your own area. All the pomp and all the circumstances being taken care of, and they sit down and hammer out the agreement. And the main thing is that Michael has no concept of property, and he really has no concept of money. Both of the things are released in such a way that it's not causing quite a stir. First is the ownership of Mars. Nobody owns Mars. It belongs to the Martians. And so if you want to be able to own any of it, you would have to talk to them. And as for the stock options, the money would be managed by Mr. Douglas. And it's not just because of the position of authority he has, but because he would be a water brother. So they give him the water of life. The ceremony goes as usual. And Mr. Douglas is in charge of Michael's finances. Now, part 2 and 3 is where I forget where the cutoffs are, but the main thing to pick up from there is the idea that along the way, they start to show Michael what love is, as well as what sex is. And the main thing they discover is that Michael is a fantastic kisser, because he has this ability to be able to just focus only on the kissing. There isn't anything else in Michael's mind but that kiss. And that amount of passion is something that none of the women in Jubal's staff have ever been able to feel in their entire lives. And then as for sex, Michael mostly sees it as a mechanical operation, as a way to be able to speed up eggs, as he calls it. Along the way, he does realize that there is a bit more to it than that. That it's more than just giving offspring, but more the idea of, just like the kissing, giving your undivided attention to somebody to be able to make it into a fiery passion. Now, the other big thing to mention as well is that at that big meeting, we are introduced to a faith in this alternate reality. The Fosterites. I hope I'm saying that right. Trying to figure out how to be able to describe him. Well, let's just say great religious leader known as Foster. And for the most part, it kind of takes the basics of the Catholic faith, but kind of removes the idea of like hell and temptation, and basically says, you know what, we're on this earth to have some fun, God made people to be beautiful, you should be enjoying that, and all that other stuff. And you can tell right away how different this religion was, as one of the senators there decides to show Michael, as well as Jillian and Jubal, around. And wouldn't you know that there is a slot machine area, as well as a bar, within the church. Obviously, Jillian is very upset by this, as she was raised very hardcore Catholic. And Jubal's like, well, you probably had bingo games, right? Well, yeah, but not on Sundays. Honey, if it's sinful one day, it's sinful every day. And that shut her up pretty quickly. Now, Jubal is pretty protective of Michael, and he wants to protect him from the one-armed bandit. So when the senator says, here, Michael, why don't you try your luck? Jubal decides to take the coin and then puts it in the slot machine. Now, ordinarily, if you lose, you would get a Bible verse from their Bible. But Michael is able to sense the mechanics of the machine, and as the numbers stop on the jackpot, the jackpot pours out, to which Michael's like, that's exciting. What happens if he does it again? And then another jackpot comes out, in which Jill's just like, Michael, stop doing that. And then they go on to the service itself, which in some ways is kind of described a bit more in the pagan tradition, in the idea that, like, there's chants, as well as people just kind of being so possessed by the Holy Spirit that they have no course of action, but they just drop to the floor and start foaming while screaming all sorts of obscenities. It is then the person in charge would bring them up and translate what this being is saying into English speech. And it's not that they're being possessed by a demon, but more being possessed by the almighty Foster. And probably the thing I find kind of hilarious about this is the senator leans over to Jubal and says, you know who that guy is? I'm afraid I don't. He used to be the star quarterback for the Rams. You know, after the service, the curtain's going to come down and you can watch the football game in one of the greatest stereo visions you're ever going to see. To which Jubal's like, I don't really follow sports. It was just something I have to chuckle at because I do find that sports is a form of religion for some people. So now there is a religion where sports is perfectly fine. Now here is where we get into part 4, and this section I found to be rather dull in all honesty. So Jubal tries his best to make Michael an independent man. So first he starts by introducing him to the concept of money, the idea of being able to spend things, to be able to buy gifts for all the people at Jubal's estate. Well, Jillian kind of helps him out by saying, okay, these are things that have to be special, something that's meant to be meaningful for him. From there, Michael and Jillian decide to strike it out on their own. With Michael's abilities, I probably should have mentioned he also has telekinesis as well. He decides to work at carnivals as a magician. Well, his act doesn't go over very well, and he is kicked from the carnival. But before they are able to go on, they make an acquaintanceship with this woman named Patty. Now, her main attraction is that from here to about her knees, she is completely covered in tattoos. For some odd reason, she wanted to go over to their place to be able to introduce them to Foster's faith a little more. Did you know that most of the tattoos around her body are actually the story about how Foster started up this religion? Well, she starts to strip for them to see, and both of them are perfectly fine with it, when Michael just decides to zap away her clothes. Well, she's a little scared at this at first, but she all of a sudden comes to the realization that Michael must be some sort of angel, and that Foster had a very similar start, the idea of being able to perform some of these miracles. They offer her some water, and she becomes another one of the Water Brothers. But they also decide to add in another step to the initiation process, which is to have sex with her. Yeah, that feels pretty out of nowhere to me as well. So, before Patty leaves, she leaves her copy of Foster's Bible, and the pair decide to go out to Vegas, where Jillian tries to make her rounds as a showgirl. Now, as Mike is becoming more and more human, Jillian is actually starting to become more and more Martian. So now, they share a bit of a mind link. And on top of that, Jill is starting to kind of tap into some of Michael's powers. With his assistance, of course, but she is still able to experience them. And one of the more interesting things is that Michael can somehow, put his mind inside of another person's body. So in this experience, Jillian is on stage when Michael decides to show her what it must be like to be one of the men in the audience. At first, she is terrified by this because all of a sudden she feels like this overwhelming sexual surge at seeing herself. And she is rather disturbed she might be a lesbian now. But after Michael explains the situation, it makes a lot more sense. Now at first, Jill is a little annoyed that Michael never really felt the same way to her. That is, until he allows her to be able to be in Michael's mind. To which she feels that same overwhelming surge as well. Now along the way, Michael has pretty much learned everything he can, except for one final step: religion. He basically takes up every single religious text that he can get his hands on, and tries to get a handle on what any of it is. To which Michael comes to the conclusion that they all solve the same problem, but they all have a very different solution. So it is there that Michael decides to start up his own faith. And that is where we get into part 5 of the book. So Michael does very well for himself, trying to establish this new faith. The first ones who have preference are the ones that were the original Water Brothers, all the people at that table during the negotiations. And we get the story from Ben Caxton telling Jubal everything that he saw when he was invited. Now, I'm not going to lie, this section of the book I found very off-putting, and it really just kind of comes down to a misinterpretation. Ben is kind of given a tour of all the different circles, as they call them, Those that have been in the faith longer get to higher levels of circles and they get very different services. And during one of the services, he spots Jillian. During part of this presentation, she goes through several different costume changes until she becomes Eve herself. Now, before all that happens, she actually manages to spot Ben in the audience. So, Ben was greatly disturbed when he's recounting all this to Jubal Hashaw. This right here is the part where I was disturbed at. So after the service, Ben is allowed into the nest where all the who's who's are, the original Water Brothers, as well as the priests and priestesses. Ben is able to see Jillian, as well as the other head priestess, Dawn. So Jillian decides to get out of her robes into more comfortable clothing as she's having a meal. To which Ben is like, "Have you put on weight?" To which Jill's just like, "Yeah, a little. You see, with Mike's help, Dawn and I are exactly identical. Here, let me show you." And then they both decide to pose together. Now this was the part where I would have ran out. Because it very much seemed like they were losing their identity to be one collective hive mind. And personally, I like being an individual. I don't mind being part of a group, but I must be an individual member of said group. So the idea that these two people were so brainwashed in the idea that looking exactly like each other was considered a fantastic thing. The only thing that annoyed them was because they couldn't share the same face. That is where I'm just like, okay. Michael has been corrupted by the human race, and now he's just gone crazy trying to control everybody and make him one giant anomalous group. But I completely misinterpreted that. It's more the idea that Jill, I guess, was the more beautiful one, while Dawn, I guess, was a little less beautiful. So the idea that Dawn had to adjust to Jill, and the idea that Jill had to put on a little weight to kind of help with Dawn a little bit, made it a little less them trying to blend into each other, and more about the idea of they admired each other so much that they wanted to be each other. Even all the thought I put into it, I'm still rather confused by it. But the main thing to note was the idea that they both had their faces. Now this was an important section, and the idea that Michael said that for the most part, all the women he saw were just one gigantic blank, and that women were interchangeable with each other. But he did notice that some women had faces that were all their own, and Jillian was one of those people. So obviously Michael was not going to have that face be destroyed. So the part that made Ben run out. So they kind of talk about the idea of Ben being put up in an initiation, to which Ben is like, "What? I didn't agree to this. I gotta go to work. I still work the newspaper. I'm still doing all of this." But after talking with one of the other members, Ben starts to relax a little bit. That is until they all start undressing and invite him for an orgy. Ben just grabs every single shred of clothes he can and just runs to Jubal. To which Jubal's just like, "What, are you mad? If I was like 30 years younger, I would have jumped at the chance to be able to do that. What is wrong with you, man?" And this is definitely one of the more challenging parts, is the idea that Ben wanted Jillian all to himself. And that was the main reason that he ran out. He didn't want to share her with all these other people. He wanted to marry her, to be able to keep her. But Jubal's just like, "But you'll still have her. You just have all these other people as well, so instead of being stuck with one broad, you'll be able to have your choice of several of them." Like I said, challenging. And I'm still not really sure how to feel about that part myself. But anyway, Ben decides to give it another chance. But before doing so, Jubal offers him 2 bets. He bets him $1,000 that they will accept him back with open arms, even though he has very much proved to them that he is not deserving of being part of this faith, as he's not ready to be able to accept their values as of yet. In the other bet, Ben is wondering how in the world his clothes disappeared so easily, to which Jubal says this is no miracle, this is just part of Mike's power of being a Martian. The next day, $2,000 appears to Jubal. It's about a week before he hears anything else, to which Ben says, I'm studying Martian. Now, when I first read that section, I'm just like, well, there's another lost soul, somebody that got brainwashed by the corrupted Mike. But as we get further into part 5, the conclusion, that's where I started to really think differently about this religion that was set up in this book. The first thing that starts up this chapter is the temple that Michael had set up is all of a sudden ablaze. There was a massive explosion. However, shortly after, Ben calls them and says, don't worry, we're all right, although we are technically dead in terms of the registration, so I can't tell you all the details. Basically, it was an inside job from both the Fosters, as well as this other group of people that see Michael as the Antichrist. Ben offers Jubal a way to be able to see everybody. They will send a contact to be able to collect them. So, Jubal immediately wants to see what exactly is going on, especially after not hearing from Ben for like the last few months. So he wants to figure out what the heck is going on there. He attempts to take a taxi, which has a lot of technical issues, when a random taxi driver passes him on the street and says, "Water of life?" To which Jubal immediately realizes that this is the contact, to which he replies, "I never thirst." Jubal is then transported to this hotel in St. Petersburg, to which the taxi driver says, "This is the only way you can get into the building. If you were to take the front door, you would be eaten alive by poisonous vipers." To which Jubal seems pretty accepting of this, basically saying, okay. So he goes in to see what this new temple is about. And there, he is able to get a better understanding of this religion. And I feel like one of the first pillars of that religion is that I've gotten this far into this review without talking about the word grok. This is a word that comes up a lot. It is a Martian word. It's never really given a clear definition, but I always interpreted the word as vibe, basically. But I think it's a bit more so than that. So the main reason that Michael, as well as his followers, are able to do all these fantastic things is because they are able to understand them 100%. So, for instance, the idea of levitation. It'd be the understanding of knowing every single molecule that would make up this book and knowing how to manipulate it in such a way that it would be able to go up or down, or to be able to manipulate it in such a way that it'd be able to disappear, to enlarge, to shrink, and other stuff like that. And Martian, the language is devised in such a way that you can actually get a deeper understanding of all this kind of stuff. And I will admit, after the way it was described from there, I had a whole different perspective on this religion. Well, actually, I should call it a discipline, because that's what Michael calls it. It was meant to be more of an additive, like you can still believe in whatever god or gods you want, and then you can just kind of add this on top of it. But probably the thing that would interest me if I was to ever go into this religion is the idea of being able to grok your body. To be able to do whatever you would want with it. You could like change your hair color, you could change your height, you could change your voice, you can change basically anything. You can regulate your body in any way. In fact, there was one guy that before he started, Michael said, you got cancer. So there was an x-ray done, and sure enough, he got cancer. But through this ability to be able to grok the human body, he was able to figure out where the cancer was, able to remove it, and even help the body heal itself. And they say those that are advanced enough in this ability to grok can even teleport. However, the main caveat I would have with joining this fictional discipline is this idea of being initiated through sex. Which, Jubal is essentially the head of the church, as he was the one that kind of taught Michael a little bit about religion, and as such he's become a bit of a legend. Even he's not above this idea that he has to have this sexual initiation. So Dawn is sent in to him in order to try to tempt him. And it's an interesting thing. She cries, but in such a way that, like, there's no blubbering or anything. She's just able to control her tear ducts in such a way that all the water is just able to pour out. To which Jubal gives in to his vices and then has sex with her. I know if I was in that situation, she would have just dehydrated, or I would have just walked out of the room, because I am not going to be forced into sex. And that's probably the weird thing, is it's the idea that if you're part of the Water Brotherhood, that is a form of consent. Jubal was not given consent, he was raped. Or at least that's my interpretation. You can feel free to put in your own if you want. Jubal has one last conversation with Michael. Michael is very much disturbed, as he was able to feel a mind link between him and the Martians, realizing that the only reason he was sent on Earth is so he could be a spy, so that Mars could be able to grok this planet Earth, and if they deem it necessary, they could destroy it, like they destroyed another planet many eons ago. And the other possibility Michael fears even more, the idea that the Martians would try to convert the humans to being Martian. To which Jubal, just like me, is thinking, isn't that what you're doing with your discipline here? Michael has to think about this for a little bit, and he thinks that Martian old ones would actually be a lot more forceful than he would be. But after the conversation, Michael feels a little more at peace. Now, during this conversation, there are random cabs as well as random passerbys that are trying to get into the hotel, and all of a sudden they just disappear. To which Michael says, hey, you don't need to worry about him. I taught Jillian how to kill people. Now this just feels wrong to me on so many levels. It's the idea that in order to destroy somebody, you have to so completely comprehend them that you almost become a part of them. And only when you have that close relationship can you just manipulate the atoms within their body to just completely make them disappear. And on top of that, if they were somehow able to establish a mind link before, then the person doing the killing would be able to know exactly what it's like to be slowly absorbed into the nothingness. Once again, that is also my interpretation of it. Michael says that the time for waiting is over. He goes out to the street to be able to see what exactly is happening with this mob. By his side is Dawn, as well as one of Jubal's men, Duke. They go out to meet this unruly mob. Michael removes all of his clothes, and he is radiantly glowing gold, basically saying he is God, because everybody is God. Which, while this is something controversial for the mob, I honestly don't really see the big deal about it. I was raised in the Catholic faith, and it is very much stated that God made people in his likeness and in his image. So, in essence, we are God, but we have also been made from God. Once again, that's my interpretation. And the best way to explain what the mob did to Michael, well, if you've ever seen the original 1980s RoboCop, And you know how RoboCop became RoboCop? It was very similar. There was very little of him left by the time he finally died. But even with his dying breath, all he said was, "I love you." Now, Jubal seems to be the only one that is completely shocked by this, because everybody else in the discipline, while they don't understand this, this was part of Michael's plan all along. And at the time of waiting and being able to grok the situation is what is going to be at hand. Jubal, knowing all his law books, as well as helping to write the agreement of Michael's assets, decides to figure out how the movement should go from here. The first thing is, he wants to buy 100-foot radius around the spot where Michael dropped dead. And on there, he wants a gravestone where all the law enforcement that were unable to stop this unruly mob will come and pay their respects to. But what the grave should be is what the topic of debate is. He was originally thinking of going with The Little Mermaid. Now this stems back from a conversation that Jubal had with Michael when he was at his house, basically saying that he very much related to The Little Mermaid in the idea that the mermaid was from the sea, but now lived on land. Just like himself, he was from the earth, but he was raised by the Martians. Because of his circumstances, he could never really be one or the either. However, Jubal thought this was too esoteric of a reference, and decided to get a likeness of what he looked like when he was completely nude in that golden radiance. Because it was publicized, getting a picture of that would not be difficult, and there was bound to be one sculptor on that earth left that could be able to do it properly. And with all the other Water Brothers, they slowly start to create their own temples. Now, in the epilogue, it is rather cryptic. So, the Martians, after getting all the information they could from Michael, realized that the Earth just isn't worth it. Sure, there is all this wrongness, and the human race may very well destroy themselves, but the Martians don't really see them as any sort of threat, and they only maybe give like 200 years to the idea of thinking about it. And at the very end, we see Michael in the afterlife talking with Foster, as well as that one senator that had introduced Michael to the Foster faith. Foster says, "I'm going on vacation. It is this Archangel Michael that is going to be in charge now." To which Michael smiled, because he knew he had a lot of work to do. And that is Stranger in a Strange Land. It is a rather unique book, to say the least, wouldn't you say? In fact, it was even a bit of a challenge to be able to summarize it all. I even missed out on a few little details here and there. This is probably a book I am not going to read again. I will admit, I'm very happy that I did read it. This, I feel like, is what good literature should do. It should challenge you. It should be able to give you a new perspective. It may be something that may be a little bit more offensive, but that offense is a good thing, because it means you are being introduced to a concept that is alien to your own. And as such, you can think about things in more broader terms. Outside of challenging, I would almost describe this book as being able to open that legendary third eye. It is a good book, but just know that there's a few sections that may or may not rock you to your core. It'll make you question a lot of different things. Maybe things you have even questioned yourself, which some of the things in this book I have. I figure after an experience like that, I should kind of relax and do something a little more on the fun side, shall we say. I was thinking back to when I did a few reviews of the James Bond books. Well, I figure let's go for the ones that I didn't get the first time. So join me next time for the first James Bond book, Casino Royale. Till next time, may you never be thirsty.